Al Jazeera podcasts.
Today, Cuba is almost out of oil as the U.S. mounts a maximum pressure campaign on the island.
If Donald Trump doesn't let fuel into Cuba, we're going to be without fuel even for lighting. We'll be in the dark with the kids in need.
The U.S. is choking off oil to the island, which is now in a worsening crisis. Will Cuba's government survive it? I'm Kevin Hirten, and this is The Take. Hi. Before we continue with today's show, remember to leave us a comment and tell us what you make of the U.S. efforts to pressure Cuba. Do you think Trump can force regime change there? And if you're listening on your favorite podcast app, please leave us a review and maybe give us a 5-star rating while you're there. It does help the show.
My name is Augustin. I'm a journalist. I'm based in Havana.
Ed, welcome to The Take. And how long have you been in Havana?
Far too long. I came when things were much, much better, back in 2012.
So here's the top line, right? In the wake of the United States military action in Venezuela, Cuba is now running out of oil. And it's pretty bad. According to the data company Kepler, it only has about 2 weeks of supply left. And we've seen these images of people queuing at gas stations outside of Havana. And now it's just yet another obstacle for the people of Cuba who have already been dealing with this a famously difficult situation. Let's start there. How are Cubans reacting to this latest crisis?
As you say, it's a crisis within a crisis within a crisis. And unsurprisingly, given that the United States is now saying that its policy aim is to stop all oil imports entering the country, of course people are scared. People know that if no oil can enter the country, if the United States is successful in its policy of collective punishment, people's living standards are going to fall even further. This is a country where most of the people spend most of the day in blackouts.
Yeah.
This is a country that used to have really world-class healthcare system, healthcare quality, and really was a beacon for the global south. I live here, I use the healthcare system. The healthcare outcomes until a few years ago similar to rich world countries. That is fraying, that is collapsing. Agricultural production is collapsing. Very difficult to sow seeds, to raise cattle, to get food to market without petrol. You just go down the list. Like if you don't have petroleum, you don't have an economy. You go back to the Stone Age. So in almost every single way you can think of that an economy works and that people rely on things, without oil, things are far, far more complicated. And Cuba has been living that complicated reality for at least 6 years now. Since Nicolas Maduro was captured or abducted, depending on how you want to call it, the power cuts have got much worse because there's less oil coming in. And now people are really, really worried about what's on the horizon.
This crisis has sort of been cascading since the U.S. removed Maduro from power. Now, it seems like Washington is going step by step, choking off Cuba's oil supply, starting with Venezuela.
Cuba will be failing pretty soon. Cuba is really a nation that's very close to failing.
So how much did Cuba rely on Venezuela for its energy needs, and how did that change when the U.S. took control of the supply there?
Cuba is heavily dependent, or was heavily dependent, on Venezuela. So, for example, a decade ago, Cuba received so much oil from Venezuela, this is in the heyday just after Hugo Chavez, that they quite literally didn't know what to do with it. They had to re-export some of it because they received more oil than their economy could use. Having said that, Cuba now doesn't have anywhere near enough oil. Last year, Cuba couldn't keep the lights on for most people most of the time. So losing Venezuela is a major blow.
So just to be clear, even with Venezuela, they couldn't keep their lights on.
Even with Venezuela, they couldn't keep their lights on most of the time for most of the provinces outside Havana, where 5/6 of the population live. People are living with 2, 3, 4 hours of electricity a day. And it's a nightmare. You can't really, it's very difficult to live in those circumstances. People waiting for the power to come on so they can cook. Maybe it will come on at 3 a.m, and so you wake up and you cook for the day. People increasingly living using charcoal, food rotting, more people getting dengue because there's no fans to keep the mosquitoes away.
Wow.
So this is how life has already been these last few years in Cuba, even before the new external shock.
And so in the midst of this already dire situation, Donald Trump is just pummeling the country with an executive order. So on Thursday, he signed an executive order calling Cuba an unusual and extraordinary threat and declared a national emergency. So just to be clear, he's declaring a national emergency for the United States because of Cuba. So help us understand the claims in this executive order. Is he citing anything specific that makes it a national emergency?
Yeah, well, apparently, according to the executive order, Hamas are operating in Cuba. Hezbollah are operating in Cuba.
Yeah.
Cuba is therefore an extraordinary threat to U.S. national security. Cuba also apparently tortures, spreads malign influence in the hemisphere. I mean, he may as well have thrown in that you had the Loch Ness Monster in Cuba as well. This is an executive order, even by Trump's own high standards, replete with falsifications.
And so there is more to this executive order. We just established that Venezuela accounted for 1/3 of Cuba's oil imports. So cutting off the supply of that wasn't apparently enough to be a knockout blow. The executive order now threatens to impose tariffs on any country that does business with Cuba. And there's one country in particular that this is signaling to, and that is Mexico. So why is Mexico so important here?
Mexico is incredibly important because Mexico has always had, they don't call it this, but we can call it a special relationship with Cuba. Out of all Latin American countries, after the Cuban Revolution in 1959, Mexico was the only one not to break off diplomatic relations. Every single other Latin American country did because of US pressure. Mexico stood up to that. And Mexico, starting under the last administration of López Obrador and continuing under the current administration, center-left administration of Claudia Sheinbaum, has sent substantial amounts of petroleum to Cuba.
Yeah.
It's not clear whether Cuba pays for that. Analysts doubt that they pay for it in cash. There are Cuban doctors operating in Mexico, thousands of them, so that may be a sort of barter arrangement, or it may be that Mexico just sends it purely as humanitarian aid. Claudia Sheinbaum, the president, describes it as humanitarian aid. But Mexican deliveries are helping keep the lights on. And last year, even before the capture of Nicolas Maduro, Mexico actually overtook Venezuela as the main oil supplier to Cuba.
So there's this special relationship that goes back decades, but just the mere threat of these sanctions, Claudia Sheinbaum made an announcement. She's going to cut off supply.
Her language has been ambiguous. She's said that she didn't discuss this directly with Donald Trump.
Mexico will seek different alternatives, clearly also in defense of Mexico, to provide humanitarian help to the Cuban people who are going through a difficult time.
She said that she's instructed the Mexican foreign minister to communicate to Washington that a humanitarian crisis has to be averted. So in broad terms, if the Trump administration's policy of this last month has been successful, then we'll now be in a situation in Cuba where we'll go from a crisis where, again, most of the people live most of the day without petroleum, with all of the affectations of quality of life that entails, to a new situation where over half of the oil that the country relies on will have within a month disappeared.
Wow. Okay. I saw a column in Cuba's main party newspaper that called what Donald Trump is doing economic genocide. Can you talk about the reaction from the Cuban government to all of this?
Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel described the measure as genocidal and criminal. They described, I was there the same morning that the United States captured and detained Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. The word they used was state terrorism. And there was real indignation in Cuba, not only at the official events where party members come and it's true believers, mainly drawn from older sections of the population, but we were out interviewing regular Cubans, and there was a real indignation and fire in people of like, how dare the United States kidnap, and this is completely how it's understood, kidnapped a head of state. And certainly the Cuban population understood on the 3rd of January that with Maduro gone, they would be vulnerable. I think that the Cuban population is in a situation right now where the government has never been less popular. It's fair to say that the government is unpopular at the moment because they've presided over a terrible economic situation, and they haven't come good on their own reform program. And the government is increasingly perceived by regular Cubans to be incompetent and lacking legitimacy. At the same time, people are
have a shared enemy.
Also lay blame at the feet. Yeah, exactly. Often the game from the US point of view is we're doing this to bring human rights and democracy. With the Trump administration, that's passé. We don't do that anymore. Donald Trump is, in a sense, out-communisting the communists. He tweeted in December, we're going to put a total and complete blockade on Cuba. The US ambassador to Cuba the other day told CNN, a real blockade is coming. Nothing is getting in. So you're in a strange place now where US language around it has flipped from, we're doing this for benign reasons, to we're going to basically strangle the economy. And so in a funny way, both the Communist Party of Cuba and the Trump administration are kind of on the same page about what's going on.
We'll have more with Ed after this break. So Ed, we should say that none of this is exactly new, right? Washington has been gunning for regime change in Cuba since the Castro Revolution in the late 1950s. For more than 50 years, it's been trying, and we should say failing, to change leadership there. I wonder why Cuba is different than Venezuela, where the Trump administration relatively easily engineered a change in leadership by abducting Nicolas Maduro a month ago.
It's very different. So I think it ought to be said that the Cuban military is weaker in many ways than the Venezuelan military. Venezuela has oodles of petrol. Cuba, as we're talking about, has hardly any. Venezuelan military has a lot of modern kit, largely Russian and Chinese. The Cuban military is using obsolete kit and struggles to train, has very few bullets. And so in terms of technology and morale, things are not good. But Cuba has a number of advantages. First off, I was speaking to a military analyst the other day, in whose estimation the Venezuelan army is the most corrupt army in all of Latin America. The Cuban military is incredibly, and this doesn't mesh with the propaganda here out of the United States, but is incredibly loyal and is very tightly disciplined. Huh. And so that makes it far more difficult to penetrate. What's very, very clear, whether or not the interim president of Venezuela was in on the Maduro kidnapping or not, and history will tell, it's very, very clear that it was largely an inside job.
Yeah,
it'd be far more difficult to find a member of the political elite to work with, an interlocutor, than in Venezuela. And that brings me to the second point: Cuban counterintelligence. Cuba has storied counterintelligence. When Barack Obama was here about 10 years ago, it was very, very clear, looking at the intelligence people from the US and Cuba facing off, that there was some sort of mutual respect. And of course, Cuban counterintelligence has spoiled the Americans time after time after time. This is the stuff of law, but it's law based in reality. I mean, there is a reason why there were so many attempts to kill Fidel Castro from the CIA, and that he died 90 after having smoked cigars all of his life. And so those are major ones. The other thing I'd point to is that Cuba's geography is its friend. It's the only country in the Caribbean that controls all of its borders. Mexico doesn't, Venezuela doesn't, Colombia doesn't. Cuba is kind of exceptional in that regard, even though it's such a basic thing. Cuba is in complete control of its territory. And that helps if you're trying to not be overthrown by a superpower. So, for example, if you cast your mind back to the 1980s, the United States ran a paramilitary war against the Nicaraguan left-wing government at the time. And they did that by having paramilitaries come over the border from Honduras, from Costa Rica. With Cuba, they can't play that game. And we saw, it's a long time ago, but Bay of Pigs, 1961, the US tried with paramilitaries and they got beat. I think the last point I would look to is that there's no organized opposition in Cuba. Much though we hear in the press, and particularly the international press, of the opposition, I can attest, I'm based in Cuba, there was never much of an organized opposition in Cuba. And most of the high-profile opposition figures that were in Cuba have left in the last few years. So the opposition is based in another country, Miami, primarily.
Interesting.
And the whole mise-en-scene, the whole dynamic of how, from a Washington planner point of view, you would actually get regime change is very difficult. So Cuba really is a different beast. And, unlike Venezuela and unlike, frankly, every other country in Latin America, despite an awful economy and despite predictions that have literally gone on for over 60 years that the regime is in imminent collapse, up until now, it's never happened.
To your point about the opposition party being in Miami, that takes me to my next question. President Trump has been the face of this pressure campaign, but U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is really considered the engineer. Now, he's a Cuban American himself. He grew up in Florida, which is home to one of the largest communities of Cuban exiles who left after the revolution. He's talked openly about regime change. Here he is speaking to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on January 28th.
Oh, no, I think we would love to see the regime there change. We would like to, that doesn't mean that we're going to make it change, but we would love to see it change. There's no doubt about the fact that it would be of great benefit to the United States if Cuba was no longer governed by an autocratic regime.
So, Ed, can you talk a little bit about how much of this policy is being driven by Marco Rubio and this small but very powerful Cuban community in the south of Florida that he came out of?
I think you're right to identify Marco Rubio as the main person behind this policy. He was also, it's widely reported, the decisive figure in convincing President Trump to go with the January 3rd capture of Maduro. And you'll see when Donald Trump speaks about Cuba, he gets asked the question, he'll say his thing about Cuba being tough or Cuba failing. And then he'll say, Marco, I don't know if you'd like to say a few words. And Marco Rubio will speak about it. So we see in the political communication that this is really Marco Rubio's domain. And the Cuban American lobby, of which Marco Rubio represents, is one of the most powerful foreign policy lobbies in the United States. And it doesn't get talked about that much. A former CIA analyst told me the other day that although they have far fewer resources, dollar for dollar, pound for pound, what the Cuban American lobby has achieved surpasses even AIPAC. And so you literally have in the new Trump administration an unprecedented amount of Cuban Americans where the lobbyists have become the policymakers. And so this is really under Rubio's and the Cuban American lobby's control.
Just 3 days after this executive order, Donald Trump is talking to reporters and he's saying he's trying to make a deal.
They have a situation that's very bad for Cuba. They have no money, they have no oil. Venezuela, they live off Venezuelan money and oil.
We've seen in the last two examples, both Venezuela and Greenland, that Trump makes these maximalist demands, but he's willing to settle for very little.
Yeah.
Short of regime change, what could possibly be an acceptable deal for Donald Trump?
We don't know. We don't know whether or not negotiations are going on. Look, frankly, and this is not consensus, this is just my own personal opinion, I think the Cubans could actually probably get, if they wanted to negotiate, a pretty good deal out of Donald Trump because he's got a short attention span. Interesting about Donald Trump. Just before he became president the first time around, he was in favor of normalization with Cuba. He said in one of the Republican primaries, 50 years is too long, folks.
Yeah.
Time to leave the embargo. The concept of opening is fine. And he also sent Trump executives to Cuba to not only look into investment opportunities, but also to patent the Trump brand shortly before becoming president. The only reason that Trump slammed Cuba with sanctions and shut down the Obama deal was because he cut a deal with Rubio the first time to win Florida. So I personally think, this isn't what Rubio wants, but I personally think that if he got a deal where he could open Trump Towers in Cuba, where he could argue that the United States is revitalizing the Cuban tourist industry, where he could say he got a better deal than Obama, and no one else has been able to do it apart from him because he's so fantastic. And if he was able to get a better deportation agreement, if that got ramped up and, who knows, maybe some handcuffs and theatrics around that, I think he could turn around to his constituency before the midterms and say, I did what no one else could. I brought capitalism to Cuba. Mm-hmm. And what the Cubans could demand in exchange is, fine, we'll give you all that. We'll give you the Trump Tower. We'll give you this on very, very beyond preferential terms. You've got to take off all the sanctions. And so I think we're in a funny place now where I'm not saying it's likely, but I think it's possible that even though the Cubans are so much weaker than they were 10 years ago when they were negotiating with the administration of Barack Obama, because of the characteristics of the Trump administration and Trump himself and the interest in real estate and property and spectacle, I think that there is a possibility that a deal could be struck that actually would be a win-win deal for all concerned. Cuban people, the Cuban government, and Donald Trump.
And finally, a Trump hotel in Havana might be great for Trump, but that's not going to solve the fundamental problems. Even if we go to a pre-Venezuela status quo, the Cuban people still need relief, don't they?
Well, of course, while it's certainly true that the Cuban economy is incredibly inefficient, it's also true that the main impediment to economic development here and the main driver of suffering is US collective punishment of the population. That's what US sanctions are. That's what they've always been. These are not so-called smart sanctions that target, just some regime officials. They target the whole of the population. And there's an infamous State Department memo back from 1960 when this policy was first being thought about. And the assistant head of Western Hemisphere Affairs in the State Department said that US policy towards Cuba should aim to, quote, bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. That policy, the broad parameters of it, haven't changed, apart from 2 brief years under Barack Obama. US policy aims to bring that about, and we're seeing this more clearly than ever with last week's attempts to literally stop all oil getting into the country. What can that bring about apart from hunger and desperation? From a US strategic planner's point of view, they've got the first 2 bits, but they haven't got the last bit. They got the hunger and the desperation. But at the point we're speaking, overthrow of government remains elusive.